So next up we have Ryan Herbst. Ryan is a junior in CSOM, pursuing a double concentration in finance and information systems with a minor in sociology. A three-sport varsity athlete in high school with football, basketball, and baseball, Ryan's obsession with sports started at a young age and included helping to teach his youngest brother's sports teams while Ryan himself was still in middle school. Ryan loves to watch, follow, and play sports, and he knows way too much information about them, being able to name the college that any NFL or NBA player attended. At BC, Ryan volunteers as a member of For Boston, is in the Shaw Leadership Program, and is also a tour guide, and also spent this past fall semester studying abroad in Barcelona. Ryan Herbst.
So thank you for the introduction. My name is Ryan Herbst, and I like sports a lot. Tonight, I'm going to talk about conference realignment and television contracts and their effect on sports, also for the athletes and the fans especially. So ESPN is a television station most of you probably know. When it was launched first in 1979, it was pretty much the first thing of its kind, a network completely about sports. People were unsure if it was going to be successful, if it was going to show sports games, show talk shows about sports, really what was going to happen with that. It obviously did successful, and now we have this, where there's a million different stations that focus on sports 24/7. You have channels specifically about individual sports, the NFL network, the golf channel, the NHL network. ESPN has multiple different platforms, ESPNU, ESPN2, you can watch it online on ESPN3. Different networks like Fox Sports have now expanded into this network as well, same with CBS, NBC. Everyone kind of wants to do this space. So then therefore this then causes these networks to compete against each other. Since there's only a finite amount of sports games, every network wants to broadcast these games. This causes bidding wars between the networks for different conferences, different sports, different games, packages, events, whether it be individual conference games in college sports to big events like the World Cup or the Olympics or different major golf events, whatever it may be. Now even college sports and individual colleges are also having their own networks. Notre Dame, as you probably know, has a television contract with NBC where every single one of their games is broadcast nationally on NBC no matter who they're playing. Doesn't matter if they're playing a rival like USC or BC or they're playing Tulsa or anyone like that. Other networks, the Big Ten has its own network as well. The SEC is now launching a network with ESPN, and these contracts are for a lot of money. The one with Texas, this is a network only for the University of Texas, and ESPN over the next 20 years is paying the University of Texas $300 million to show everything that's going on at the University of Texas in sports, things about their coaches, individual players, whatever it may be. The SEC network is getting paid $2.25 billion by ESPN over the next 20 years. And that money gets spread out just across those conference teams. For the one for Texas, that's only for Texas. They don't have to share that with anyone else. So the way the conference realignment started, in the SEC at least, this is a good example to start with, that Texas A&M in the bottom left and Missouri in the top left left the Big 12 to join the SEC. Now this was seen as a way for the SEC to gain more traction in a state like Texas where there's big recruiting hotbeds and a lot of teams from the SEC want to recruit players from Texas. Now this is more specifically for football. Football is what drove all of this conference realignment. Football is the one that makes the most money. A lot of times they don't really care about the other sports that's going on. It's true though, because in football, those are the games that are on TV that are making so much money. Texas A&M with Johnny Manziel, who just won the Heisman 2 years ago and is a kind of hot button topic, generated an incredible amount of revenue for the school and was kind of seen as them being successful in their new conference. Same with Missouri. They just made it to the SEC championship game in just their second year. So it's seen as, they're being successful in this conference realignment. Their other sports, however, have been suffering a little bit. So kind of their effect on other athletes. The basketball teams from Texas A&M and Missouri finished at the bottom of the SEC, and their baseball teams are currently dead last. Those teams did a little bit better in the Big 12, but can't compete in the other sports because they're not used to recruiting for those sports as much. Those schools, maybe they don't have the facilities to kind of do as well in those sports. Now also, in terms of its effect on the fans, you see this line that kind of separates the SEC East versus the SEC West. The way that scheduling works for football is there's 14 teams and only 8 conference games. So you obviously can't play every team every year. So not only does it affect the players, it affects the fans. You play, in those 8 games, you play the other 6 teams in your conference, or in your division, so in the SEC West or the SEC East, one team from the other division every single year, the same one, and then the other one rotates. So for example, if you're the University of Kentucky and you're a fan of Kentucky or you're a student there, and maybe you want to see the University of Alabama play because they're really good, they're typically one of the best teams in the country. They only host the University of Alabama once every 12 years. So then they only play them once every 6 years. So you could be a student and not see a game against the University of Kentucky at all. Or against the University of Alabama at all. Yeah, you see games against Georgia or Florida, and they're fun to tailgate and things like that. But if you're a fan and like to enjoy those games and have fun, you're not seeing maybe the most fun aspects, or you're missing out on something. So that kind of affects the fans. And then this is just one example of a new super conference. The way it kind of started was in the Big East, in basketball specifically. So this was the Big East. As you can see, Marquette is in Wisconsin, and DePaul is in Chicago, and Notre Dame is in Indiana, and those are not on the East Coast. But other schools were on the East Coast, so yeah, it's called the Big East, right? Makes sense. And then those schools, they decided to expand out because they wanted that power conference. They had 16 teams in the conference. They also had added South Florida later, and schools that are not very close to each other. So from a player's standpoint, these schools now you have to fly from UConn to Marquette or from Syracuse to South Florida to play these games, and these athletes are still supposed to be college students and go to class and do well and do all the college stuff. A little hard when you have to travel very far for a Tuesday night basketball game. And then also, these conferences didn't even last that long because they wanted the big TV contract from ESPN. They did get a big TV contract from ESPN. Then they saw all the contracts that the football schools were getting. The SEC, the Big 12, the Pac-10 were getting massive, massive contracts. So a lot of these schools wanted to join those bigger conferences like the ACC. However, not all of these schools have Division I football teams. So you see Pitt, they have a Division I football team, but Georgetown doesn't. So then these teams tried to leave even more. You ended up with a Big East that was going to look like this at one point, where Boise and San Diego State were going to be in the Big East after all these other schools left. West Virginia left to the Big 12. They're playing teams in Texas and Oklahoma, Kansas. West Virginia isn't that close to them. Syracuse and Pitt and Louisville left to come to the ACC where BC is. And even BC, we're not even that close to Miami or North Carolina, and all of our teams, not just the football team have to travel down there, the tennis team, the field hockey, all those teams have to travel as well. This never actually happened because Boise State and San Diego State, after signing contracts to join, backed out, and this ended up being the Big East. Only a basketball conference of only Catholic schools that don't have Division I football teams. A very, very specific niche. They also were almost going to be called the Catholic 7 or 8 or however many teams were going to be there. But they wanted the brand equity of the Big East. So there was a big fight over that because the Big East was going to get a big TV contract and be able to play their conference championship at Madison Square Garden in New York City. So the other schools that I just showed, they basically, the ones on the right, got stuck in what's now called the American Athletic Conference, a brand new conference that doesn't have the same brand equity as the Big East. And ESPN, because they had the contract with the Big East, tried to argue that they owned the rights to the name of the Big East and could do with it they want. Because these teams ended up voiding their deal with ESPN and signed a TV contract with Fox Sports 1, a new TV network that Fox was launching. And so these games were not on ESPN. So they're still called the Big East, but Creighton's now in Nebraska, so we're moving further and further west as we go. Now, this could also affect the competition. So this bracket was the Big East tournament bracket while it still had 16 teams. So this is when Marquette and DePaul were still in it. And there were so many teams and so many byes that the teams that had done well and earned the byes were then waiting so long that they ended up losing most of the time in their first round games to teams that had been playing a few days and been playing hot. This kind of extends to other sports. BC hockey a couple weeks ago lost to Notre Dame after we hadn't played in about 2 weeks and Notre Dame had been playing consistently. Thankfully, we're in the Frozen Four now, so it's okay. But then also in the NCAA basketball tournament, the teams that were supposedly the worst teams to get in were supposed to play in a play-in game. And that first round game, a team that has played in that round has made it to the next weekend, so advanced and won at least 2 more games every single year that that's existed. VCU even made it to the Final Four, and Tennessee this year made it to the Sweet 16. So those schools are supposed to not win, but because they're kind of playing more games or maybe on a hot streak now, get some more momentum, that's kind of affecting the balance of play. Speaking of the NCAA tournament, did any of you watch the Final Four this weekend? I didn't because I was at Showdown, but for those of you that may have tried to watch it, you may have noticed that it wasn't actually on CBS this year. CBS is a major network, but the Final Four games were on TBS this year. TBS is a more, obviously not a national, or it's a national network, but it's not obviously as big as CBS. However, the NCAA tournament now has a TV contract with a dual contract with CBS and TNT and TBS and True TV, where those the NCAA tournament games are spread across the networks because ESPN was trying to make a huge push to get those games and put it across their ESPNU and ESPN2 and online on ESPN3 and on all these other platforms that they have. And now the national championship game will be on TBS starting in 2016 on every even year up to 2024, and on CBS in the odd years. So just kind of in terms of the fans trying to watch the games, it's maybe a little bit confusing. More for the fans, the start of the college football season and a lot of times the college basketball season as well can be difficult for the fans because the TV networks like ESPN, CBS want the biggest games that will attract the most viewers. So for example, to start last season, Michigan and Alabama played. Attracts a lot of viewers, 2 big names. However, that game was played in Dallas, nowhere near Michigan or Alabama, so it loses out for the fans. For example, if BC had to play Notre Dame and it was considered maybe a home game for BC, but we played it in New York or on a neutral site, that wouldn't be as fun for us. We wouldn't be able to watch it. That's what's happening with those schools. And then also these contracts are getting made so far in advance that game was decided in like 2007 that they were going to play. Teams already have games that they're going to play in the year 2022 and 2024. The University of Cincinnati is planning a stadium renovation that'll be open in 2017, and they're already trying to get games, lock-in games that will be on ESPN's network in 2017 to show off their new stadium renovation. The way that these contracts work also expand to the pro sports as well. Just to touch on that a little bit, the NFL, the way that their flex games work for Sunday Night Football and primetime games is towards the end of the season, they can basically change the games to put a better game on primetime. However, there's so many little intricacies. For example, this year, a Patriots-Ravens game was flexed out of primetime, even though that was a better game than the Bears-Eagles game, because if the Bears-Eagles game wasn't flexed, then they couldn't possibly do another flex the next week because of all these intricacies where the amount of games on Fox and CBS had to be within a range of 3. It sounds really complicated, and it is, and it keeps being complicated because NFL teams have even more little rules like that, where an NFL team cannot have more than 5 primetime games in a season. So even though you see Tom Brady and Peyton Manning all the time, they can't be on Sunday night or Monday night or Thursday night more than 5 times. And then also with their little intricacies even more, they control everything about these teams. They control everything with the networks. They control what channel the games are on. You don't have to actually look at your TV guide to see what channel the games are on, because any game between AFC teams is going to be on CBS. Any game between NFC teams is going to be on Fox. And then if the AFC team is at home against an NFC team, it'll be on Fox, and if it's vice versa, then it'll be on CBS. So you don't actually have to ever actually look at your channel guide. And then even more so, the NFL controls what you're going to wear on the field too, and what you'll see, what the fans would see. They control if you're going to wear Nike stuff, because now they have a contract with Nike. Before it was only with Reebok. They'll fine NFL players if they're wearing something other than that. And then with the jerseys, teams can only designate 1 alternate jersey per year, and then after that, they can only wear that alternate jersey up to 2 times per season. So if you're a Patriots fan and you like their cool red jerseys or the powder blues of the Chargers or cool other jerseys like that, you can only see them twice a year. They kind of limit those rules. Contrast that with the NBA, where they force them to wear jerseys basically whenever they want. There's Hispanic Heritage Month jerseys that say El Heat, because that's Spanish, and other and other jerseys that they've added long sleeves to and are tight-fitting and kind of look weird. LeBron has even said that he doesn't like wearing those jerseys and it affects the way he plays. That might just be an excuse for when he misses shots and loses to the Spurs, but the NBA can kind of make them do whatever they want with that. Contrast that again to bring it back and tie it into college sports, where college teams can wear anything. They wear absolutely everything. Oregon is famous for wearing a different combination of jersey and helmet and pants for every single game in the season. They don't repeat anything. Basketball teams now, like Cincinnati and Baylor, are wearing with like stripes and claws and neon everywhere, and the gloves. And Maryland is wearing their state flag on their jerseys now because that's a thing to do. I mean, they're wearing it. They're trying to get recruits to come, get college-age kids more interested in coming. But kind of going off of what I was talking about with the NFL and the NBA teams, college has less control over exactly what they're wearing compared to those pro teams, but they're controlling so many more things. So where do we go from here? I mean, conference realignment is pretty stable, I think, at the moment at least. Now we have some conferences that are bigger. They have 14 teams, 16 teams now. So you'll kind of see maybe how these teams react to it. The University of Utah and Colorado have moved into the Pac-12 a couple years ago. They haven't done very well. So on the whole, most teams haven't done extremely well. Syracuse did do well in the ACC this year, except they lost the last like 4 or 5 games of the season, including one to us. So they are still struggling a little bit. Texas A&M and Missouri are kind of seen as the schools that have done the best. And even then, there are other programs other than football, the ones that generate the most money, have not been doing well. Some of these schools have been saying, though, that, or at least using as a defense, that the money that they're generating from football is then going towards their other sports, the ones that maybe don't make as much money, to try to, maybe it'll fund the girls volleyball team at these schools. That's just kind of what they're saying. I don't know where the money is actually going. A lot of these schools are private institutions and don't have to disclose this. But in terms of that, I think conference realignment is a little bit set for now. Television contracts are locked in for the next 10 years for many of these sports. And thank you. Thanks for listening to me, and I hope you have a good night.